include, and what is Singapore Maths? We're also looking at the misconceptions surrounding dyslexia and how to support our learners better. It's another thrilling morning. Prepare for takeoff.
Live from London, this is the Sunday Morning Breakfast Show with Sobia Iqbal on Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live on the Podbean app or desktop player. Just head over to www.podbean.com/LSW/TT Radio or search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TT Radio.
We're celebrating all things wonderful and maths in advance of Maths Week. It's happening on the 28th of June to the 2nd of July. We're discussing how to develop mastery in the subject, thoughts on the new research review series, and we're also looking at Singapore Maths. I'm joined by the amazing Peter Mattock, author of Visible Maths. Peter is an assistant head, secondary mastery lead, and also a Maths SLE PD lead. Also with us is Lee Overy, an assistant director of learning mathematics, a mastery specialist, PD lead, and a chartered engineer. Mohit Uddin Ahmed will also be calling in later to explain Singapore Maths in more detail, as he is the founder and director of the Singapore Maths Academy. In the second half of the show, we have Martin from Dyslexia Bites, who'll be discussing the misconceptions surrounding dyslexia, how to support learners in class, and those who don't believe it exists. Wow, that's the longest introduction I've ever done. And it's because I've got such wonderful guests on today, and it's a jam-packed show. We've got lots for you today. So starting off, I just wanted to say hello to all my guests. First, Lee and Peter, how are you?
Morning.
Morning, Sobia.
How is everyone?
Yes, very well, thank you. Thank you very much for having us on.
That's absolutely fine. I'm actually looking forward to it. Thanks for coming on. Just to outline for my listeners, I'm going to start off with Peter and Lee, and then we're going to bring in Mohi later on when we're discussing Singapore Maths. Mohi, if you're listening, I can see you in the studio. Just call around the time that you need to. If you want to get involved in the conversation beforehand, please feel free to do so as well. Okay, so introducing Peter, first of all. Peter, can you explain your journey leading up to now? What is your role and what do you do?
Yeah, so I've been teaching maths for about 15 years now, started in 2006. Fairly standard career trajectory, started in a secondary school. It's always been secondary schools. Head of maths after about 4 or 5 years or so, and then moved to my current school about 7 years ago as director of learning for maths and numeracy, and very recently made the jump to assistant head in the last year or so at the same school. And while doing that, I did several other bits and pieces. I was accredited as an SLE, as you've mentioned. I went through the NCTM PD lead course to be accredited for that. And I was in the first cohort of the NCTM's secondary teaching for mastery sort of program, which is now up into its 5th year, I think, cohort 5. And following the first year or following the first couple of years of that, they appointed these secondary teaching for mastery leads with each hub. So I've been doing that for the last sort of 2 or 3 years alongside my role in schools.
That sounds fantastic. You've obviously had an amazing journey to get to this stage. You're also a published author and a blogger. Can you tell us a little bit about Visible Maths? What is it all about?
Yes, so Visible Maths is basically about the use of concrete and pictorial representations to help make sense of mathematical ideas. And I got into this sort of a number of years ago. I was doing some PD videos for Pearson as part of their active teach platform. And it was at the time where things like bar modeling and stuff like that from Singapore, from Shanghai, were just starting to, people were just starting to become more aware of them in this country, and they wanted these sort of included in the PD videos. And this was, something that was relatively new to me at the time, but I sort of looked into it, got into it, and sort of went down the rabbit hole a little bit with it, basically. And that led to, several years looking at manipulatives and representations and how they are useful and how they can support pupils in making sense of mathematical ideas. And what I noticed is that a lot of the stuff I was reading and a lot of the stuff I was getting into was rather fragmented or piecemeal and had come from different sort of areas. And so I thought it was a good idea to sort of collect these things together as a sort of go-to place for people to sort of who want to get on that journey themselves to have a look at. And that's what Visible Maths was ultimately aimed at. And then my YouTube channel following that to sort of explore some of those sort of in a more dynamic way. But generally, it's about what are good ways of helping students make sense of mathematical ideas through concrete materials, through imagery, through representation, to help that sort of conceptual understanding.
Okay, that sounds great. I understand that in a pictorial way, students understand more. And I guess that's what you've tried to do with Visible Maths. You wrote an article for the test that said, why should we teach the why before the how in maths? Because this is an issue. So can you just explain that article and what was your reasoning and thinking behind it?
Yeah, so, I mean, there's a lot of, in Maths Edu Twitter, there's a lot of sort of discussion and debate about whether sort of what one might term procedural fluency, the ability to carry out procedures in a relatively automatic and fluent sort of way, should precede conceptual understanding or should be built upon conceptual understanding. And there are arguments back and forth about how, if students are very, very good at carrying out a procedure for a certain thing, that might support them in learning about the structures around that sort of thing. But for me, the danger I felt with that, and the sort of worries that I had with people who were espousing this sort of view, was that the pupils never actually get to the why, and they never actually get, and sort of the how and why. I'm not overly keen on the language with that now. It's more about sort of, do I teach about this idea, or do I teach kids to do this thing? And there was a danger I felt that mathematics education, which has long been sort of accused of being very much getting kids to do stuff without much in the way of thinking or understanding anyway, that we were sort of regressing to that point where we were going to produce a generation of mathematicians that knew how to do an awful lot of stuff, but didn't really have any understanding of what that did, or why it did what it did, or how that linked to sort of the wider maths concepts and the wider structures that underpin mathematics. And so for me, teaching around that, I felt was more important, and that those things, when you look at it through those lenses, those things naturally lead to how to do these things anyway. So teaching about, and I'd say I prefer the language of teaching about, say, addition, helps me understand why the column addition algorithm does what it does, and gives me greater insight into the column addition algorithm when I come to learn it, rather than the other way around.
Yeah, I mean, I would be inclined to agree, because when I was learning maths, I have a curious brain. I always want to know why I'm doing things before I actually attempt them. And I think it's different for everyone. Some people just like to get straight into it. But as a teacher, as a practitioner, I do think it's important for students to understand why they're doing things. And so I can agree with you on that. You wrote another article on ability groupings, and this is a big issue in maths and English and even science. Should we have ability groupings? Should we have streaming or not? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, better people than me have written about this in quite some length now, and people in sort of Maths Edu Twitter will have seen these articles and know these things. And generally, it comes down to streaming, which, if you're talking about the difference between streaming and setting, streaming being a sort of general setting by prior attainment data for all subjects. So, the typical sort of streaming model might be something along the lines of a secondary school takes Key Stage 2 data from a primary school and uses that to group students into groups that they are going to attend all of their subjects in. So you can have a top group that got the top Key Stage 2 scores, and they're going to attend all of their subjects together, and then so on, working down. That's probably the least sort of successful model for grouping students. And I say probably because the research around this sort of stuff is very, very piecemeal and sometimes contradictory, and sometimes, isn't widely applicable in a lot of settings and things like that. So, but that is probably the least effective way to group students. In terms of mixed ability versus setting, it's very much of a muchness. There are some indications potentially that setting would benefit higher attainers and disadvantage lower prior attainers. There's some evidence that may not be the case. There's some evidence that mixed ability might benefit the lower attainers more. I think, unless you have an ideological standpoint, and that's important to recognize, that there are some people that see setting and mixed ability as sort of in an ideological background. Should we be segregating who we see as the best from who we see as the worst and things like that? And that sits with some people, in an uncomfortable way from a moral and ideological standpoint. But if we're purely talking about the sort of mechanics for what of grouping students in a way that is best for them to learn maths, then depending on the curricular approach you're going to use, and we might talk about that when we get into mastery of mathematics and things like that, but depending on the curricular approach that you're going to use and the sort of the way you're going to teach mathematics, there's no really strong indicative evidence to say do this or do that. What there is very good evidence for is whatever you are going to do, make sure you invest the time with your teachers to make sure they can do that well. And don't make big changes to these things unless you have invested the time for teachers to do that well. So if you're talking about moving from a setting model to a mixed ability model, you need to take the time to make sure your teachers are going to be able to teach in a mixed ability in a good way and in a way that is going to benefit learners. If you're talking about moving the other way, same difference. If you've not got the time to invest in that, or you've not got the the capacity to develop that within your staff, you are better off staying as you are, I think, is the general sort of message there. But whether you do one or the other will as much depend on sort of your ideological standpoint, what it is you value in maths teaching, what curriculum models you are going to use, than it will any evidence sort of strongly indicating that this or that is the better way to do it.
Thank you so much for going through that. That made a lot more sense now. Can I ask, Lee, can you hear me properly?
Yep, I can.
Okay, hi Lee. Can you explain your journey leading up to now? What's your role and what do you do?
Okay, well, back in '92, I got a Bachelor of Engineering. So my route was 17 years working as an engineer and becoming a chartered engineer. And then I had a moment where I thought I want to do something else, and that was around 2010. So I did my PGCE. And I wanted to focus on maths, and engineering is very mathematical. So I suppose I did a lot of computer programming as well, which is algebraic. So I found myself in that position and wanted to do something other than making profit, I suppose, for companies. And so I got my PGCE and I did a master's around 2013-14. That was a master's in maths education, which taught me the value of research. And then I think I was okay. I was teaching. I think I felt there was something missing, and I think what was missing for me was structure. Was a structure on how I should teach on a daily, weekly, or even over a course of a sequence of learning. I didn't feel I had the structure. And my turning point was around 2015. And I attended a primary mathematics conference in London where I heard a couple of speakers. One of them was a chap called Yeet Ban Ha, who's a master teacher from Singapore. And he did a presentation which caught my interest. He was talking about Singapore and their success. And the other speaker back then was Tim Oates, who was talking about the value of textbooks. So I was starting to think about what they talked about, and around the same time, I got the opportunity to do some secondary training with Yeet Ban Ha. So very much focused on Singapore textbooks. So things were starting to come together for me, and I got hold of the textbooks that he was referring to in that training. That, by the way, if you get the chance to hear him speak, by the way, he's quite inspirational. And so I did a day's training with him. I got hold of the textbooks. The following year, I did further training with another Singapore master teacher over a long period of time, which started to put more pieces together for me. And I started to use the textbooks as a structure for my teaching from around 2015. And I presented through a few workshops some of the aspects of these of the approach from Singapore, plus some aspects from my master's degree. And I've worked in just to bring you back right up to date. I've worked in about 3 different schools in Leicestershire, different in different areas of Leicestershire. So and I'm now an assistant director of learning in a small school.
That sounds fantastic, Lee. I mean, clearly you've, like Pete, you've got lots of experience. Can you just explain to me, why do you feel the UK maths education is behind other countries? Do you think there's a problem with the way that we teach maths in the UK?
My impression from, and as well as my experience of the 3 schools, my impression of perhaps discussions on EduTwitter, and just what I see and what I pick up. I think there's so many different systems. I think people are using different schemes of work. Some textbooks don't appear to be in fashion, and I think, you know, I'm very passionate about textbooks for reasons I can go into later. But I think there isn't a common approach to teacher training. I think there's there isn't a good use of textbooks. I think people are creating different schemes of work, and the sequencing of those schemes of work is really important. And I think also we don't invest time in CPD, and I think a lot of people who are willing to read in their own time, or willing to read and then try things out in the classroom, are at an advantage, because I think the normal school day is just so busy for a lot of teachers. I just don't think that a lot of people have the time to do that reading, or the incentive to do that reading, if they're tired at the end of the day.
And that brings me nicely on to my next question. So if we're thinking about a maths curriculum, and Pete, please do get involved in this as well, if you can hear me. What does an outstanding maths curriculum look like? We'll start off with Lee, and then we'll come over to Pete again.
Well, I would say, I mean, another thing I forgot to mention, I'm on the Mastery Cohort 5 that Pete's referred to, and
okay,
and it puts what's good about that. It puts together what I've learned about the approach in Singapore compared to what we're currently, or what the NCETM are advocating in the UK, and there's lots of similarities. So I think a good maths curriculum contains the ideas that the NCETM are advocating. So the 5 big ideas are coherence, representation and structure, mathematical thinking, fluency and variation. And I think that summarizes it quite nicely.
What about you, Pete? What do you think makes an outstanding maths curriculum?
Yeah, I think Lee's right. I think there's definitely part of it. And I think in terms of curricular thinking, I think the one that stands out there is coherence. And we're going to talk later as well about the research report from the DFE on this, and there are other areas that talk about this as well. But this idea that maths is in essence a hierarchical subject, although there's a lot of circling back and a lot of things building on each other. And I think, some way of capturing that journey and making that journey make sense to pupils. The biggest thing that maths is sort of accused of in terms of being detrimental to, as I've said before, is taking mathematics as a series of sort of isolated things that you teach a kid about this thing, and then you teach a kid about this thing, and you teach a kid to do this thing, and teach a kid to do this thing. and neither the twain shall meet, as they were. There's no sense of how these ideas are related, how these procedures are related, how these stem from a common area of mathematics or build into a common area of mathematics, and it's all just very piecemeal and isolated. And I think when you look at those countries those jurisdictions that are sort of widely recognized as having an outstanding maths curriculum, that journey is much more carefully structured and thought through. And you talk about the Asian jurisdictions like Singapore, like Shanghai, and Japan as well, places like that, where they put a lot of thought, generations worth of thought. I'm sure we will later on talk about, Singapore starting this in the 1980s, generations worth of thought into what does a coherent journey for mathematics learning look like, and how is that structured so that kids build on their knowledge as it accumulates, and how those links and connections all make sense as they come together. And an outstanding maths curriculum has to really do that, and that reflects back to number 5 that you talked about with Lee, about why is maths education behind other countries. And one of the big reasons maths education is behind other countries is that there's never been the sort of will to put that sort of thing together on a sustained level. We've had multiple revisions to the national curriculum, we've had the national numeracy strategies, national strategies, we've had this, we've had that, we've had tweaks and changes and wholesale changes at curriculum level, at assessment level, and all sorts. And there's never been that will to actually say, no, you know what, we're going to really take the time to think about what does this journey look like for a pupil to learn school level mathematics, and we're going to commit to that journey, and we're going to develop expertise in that journey across all levels. And if we did that, then we'd probably have an outstanding maths curriculum in this country.
I mean, yeah, I can understand that. I mean, when I'm teaching, so I've taught computer science in the past, and I've taught business studies, and there's a lot of maths that's involved in my subject as well. And I often find that students can't do things that they should have learned in maths in my subject. And sometimes it's a case of because they've not learned it in maths yet. And that means that the curriculum in our school needs to be looked at in a much better way, so that it's more cohesive, so subjects are working at a similar level. But there's also this idea of transferable skills, that students cannot use certain skills in certain subjects and bring them over to other subjects. Why is that, and how can we help other subjects embed maths in their curriculum areas to make it much better?
Well,
so I think.
Okay, go on, Pete. Sorry.
Oh, you're going to go, Lee?
No, I was just going to say. I was just going to say. All right. You go.
Yeah, let's start with Pete.
Lovely. Okay, so I mean, I think a lot of this sort of idea of transferable to other areas, and talk about transferable skills, and there's a question mark over how much of that is skill and skill based, in terms of what are we asking pupils to recognize from their maths education that is occurring in these other subject areas, if you like, and some of that's down to recency. Has it recently been looked at in maths, and and our students, is there that sort of retrieval and that spaced retrieval and interleaving that will allow students to recall those ideas and keep those ideas in mind. There's something in there about Q as well, and about the other subjects. You mentioned business, computing, the science, design, technology, all of these places as well that that use very explicit mathematical ideas in their curriculum. Are they being talked about using the same language? Is it recognizable? And I think, again, this comes back to earlier when we talked about teaching the why before the how, or for my preference, teaching about before teaching to do. That if these things look the same, if they are recognizably the same, if pupils can look at this and say, oh, well, that's the same thing that I was doing here, then you are much more likely to get that transference, because those cues are embedded in their, in their schema, in their, their web of knowledge around mathematics and that particular mathematical idea. Whereas if kids have only been taught, well, to solve problems like this, you do this, and to solve problems like this, you do this, then as soon as the problem doesn't look like that or that, they're stumped. And, very often in the other subjects, the context may look different, but the underlying structure is the same. And for kids, if kids don't have that recognition of, oh, well, this is what that mathematical idea looks like, then they're never going to be able to transfer it. So for me, it comes back to that. If we teach about mathematical ideas, and if all of the teachers that are using those mathematical ideas understand how that fits into, bigger mathematical structures, bigger mathematical ideas, then we'll get that transference. But I mean, that's a huge job, not only teacher training for virtually every teacher that's currently teaching now, but also a huge job in terms of curriculum to make sure that our next generation of teachers and our generation of teachers after that understand these ideas and understand these mathematical structures, so that when they see them in areas that they teach, that they may not go on to be mathematics teachers, but when they go on and teach mathematical ideas through their subject, that they recognize what mathematical idea it is, and they can help students make those links.
Okay, that's great. I really appreciate the fact that we have to have a common language, and we need to work together as departments to understand that clearly, to make sure that all students understand what's going on. Lee, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say some of that. I mean, common methods and common language were a couple of things I was thinking about. I mean, I think we have an issue just within maths alone about common methods and common language, and I think my experiences are that we have that issue even at school level. Never mind national level. And I think as well as everything Pete said, I mean, the implementation of this is huge, because I think we're still trying to get our own house in order in mathematics in this regard. And if we're talking about using that looking at common methods and common language across subjects, that's an even bigger task. I did one project working with a science teacher where we looked at commonalities and differences. And a lot of things came up between things like graphs, how we rearrange formulae, and the methods were clearly different just between our different departments in a school, and that project wasn't about trying to even make more common the language, because that becomes a longer term project. This was just really a project to highlight what the differences and similarities are. So I think we're a long way away from it, to be honest. And I think it's something to have to aim at in the future, is to look, but how that would be coordinated, I think it's difficult to envisage.
Okay, so that's something that we need to work towards in the future. As a profession, we need to think about in terms of maths delivery and how we're going to move forward with that. So in terms of, we've talked about what makes outstanding maths provision. How do we achieve mastery in maths, and what do we mean by mastery? Let's start off with Lee, and then we'll come to Pete.
Okay, well, I suppose I'm at the beginning of the journey in one respect, in that I've joined the NCETM Mastery Cohort 5. So it's a 3-year program for those that don't know, and I'm in year 1, which is really to establish mastery in my own practice. And mastery involves the big ideas that I mentioned earlier in terms of the NECTM, but what's been pleasing is that there's lots of commonality with the approach taken in Singapore. So, for instance, the use of manipulatives or pictorial or concrete examples. I mean, that which Pete mentioned earlier, that's a big theme in Singapore textbooks. And the connectedness and the sequencing and the fluency and the continuous retrieval and interleaving of the previous topics, so that spiraling curriculum that Peter mentioned, is also present. So in a way, I'm at the beginning of the journey, but I've got 5 years of experience with the Singapore textbooks to mesh together with the with this new approach, which is good. But I think as a summary, I mean, the things we've talked about, the things I've mentioned in the 5 big ideas are a nice summary of, for me, as to what mastery means. Because I think the word mastery has been used and misused recently, and I think it is still used in marketing terms. So I think it is. We do need to be careful when the word's being used, and to clarify when it is used exactly what we're talking about.
Okay, thanks for that, Lee. What about you, Pete?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first thing to say is that in terms of mastery, we've got to draw the distinction, I think, between this sort of curriculum pedagogical approach towards mastery, which is, has roots going back 100 years or so. And again, better people than me have written in detail and have spoken in detail about this. But to summarize, it's about the use of very homogenous groups. So this would, when I was talking earlier about ability grouping, if you are trying to employ a sort of mastery approach to your pedagogy, to your teaching, and to your curriculum, that would imply that you have very homogenous groups that are very, very close to each other in terms of prior attainment and ability, and students that are very, very close to each other in terms of prior attainment or ability, that you build on, that you take the time to assess their prerequisites and to make sure that you understand where they are in their journey of learning about maths, and that if anybody is in some way, doesn't have the prerequisites, that hasn't understood what they need to understand in order to move on to this new mathematical idea, that you take the time to secure those prerequisites, that you make sure your teaching is highly impactful in learning this new idea, and you use a lot of formative assessment to make sure that happens, and that you aim for very, very high success rate. Bloom, I think, in his 1968 paper talked about something like 90% for 90%, 90% success rate for 90% of the kids, and most people, I think, now sort of talk about maybe 80%. I'd need to go back to the paper to be sure, but this sort of very high success rate, and that's a sort of mastery curriculum model. But what it doesn't do in that model is necessarily tell you how you achieve that high success rate. And I think that's where the sort of NCTM's ideas on teaching for mastery, and what we might hear about in terms of Singapore and the other high performing jurisdictions, around the country, around the world, how do they actually achieve such a high success rate? And I think that's where the ideas from the NCTM come in, to sort of make sure that kids are understanding mathematical structure. Because I mean, if you think about ultimately, how do you know if you turn this question around, how do we achieve mastery in maths? You turn it around and you say, how do you know that somebody has achieved mastery, in the knowledge that actually mastery is a continuum, and it's never something that is achieved, never something that is reached. It's just something you develop and you keep developing. But how would you say somebody is well along that journey to mastery? It's probably something to do with when they can apply ideas from mathematics in potentially novel situations without having recently looked at it. Mark McCourt, who may well people will be aware of,
Yes,
talks about the transfer without recency and cue. And so, when it's not necessarily queued up for a student to be able to spot in the question the little clues that say, oh, well, this is this, or when they haven't studied it recently, can they still apply that idea? And, if you take that as the sort of benchmark for recognizing that pupils have achieved a mastery in a particular area of mathematics, then, how you get there is likely to be through students understanding structure, so that when they read this problem or read this question, they recognize the area of maths, that it's being built upon, and having, worked through some of those other ideas that the NCTM are going to talk about in terms of having achieved or had, some measure of fluency, having been able to have opportunities in their lessons to apply their mathematics and to, have to think mathematically, think like a mathematician. The use of variation theory to sort of draw out details of that underlying structure, the use of manipulatives and representations to allow pupils to engage with that structure. All of these things are likely to be sort of good practices that will support that journey for mastery.
Okay, that's fantastic. That's like summarized everything for me. I'm just going to bring Mohi in now because Mohi's got a good quote about mastery. Can you hear me, Mohi?
Hi there, Sobia. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yeah, I can hear you. We were just talking about mastery, and you said you had something to add onto about mastery.
Yeah. I mean, mastery is something that NCTM have been really pushing over the last 5 to 8 years, I think it is now. But as Pete mentioned, that it's something that's been around for over 100 years, and so I wanted to quote something that I got from a CPD session from Professor Akiko Takahashi from DePaul University, and it's 10 pages of mathematics understood are better than 100 memorized and not understood, and 1 page actually worked out independently is better than 10 pages clearly but passively understood. The question is not how much, but how. The object is mastery, attainment of the spirit of the subject, and not to train the memory or to ingest a large bulk of mathematical facts and formulas. And this book is, this quote rather, is from a book called The Teaching of Mathematics from Jacob William Albert Young from 1908. So around about 113 years or so ago. And so sometimes we feel that mastery is something quite new, something that's been pushing, someone's been pushing, or NCTM have been pushing towards maths teachers, but it's actually over 100 years old, and it's something that we're trying to work out. And so I think with the definition of mastery, I don't think it can ever be succinct and it can ever be 100% clear, and hence why I think a lot of teachers are still quite confused by the term mastery, because as Lee mentioned, that is also being used as a marketing tool for many various different companies. And so that's something I wanted to add.
Thank you for that, Mohi. What do you think, Pete and Lee? Start off with Lee first. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I mean an old system. Yeah, it's certainly not new. I know Mark McCourt's talks about cycles and fashions that seem to come up every 30 years. But mastery as such isn't a fashion. It's based on solid principles. It's very difficult to define, I think, and I think everybody's got a slightly different definition, and I think it doesn't help that it's difficult to define, and I think it does create a little bit of confusion. And from
that quote, sorry to interrupt, Lee, from that quote, he talks about memorization is not a good way of learning math. So, I mean, is rote learning included in that?
Well, I mean, there's a role for quick recall, and I think the report, the DFE report, as well as the guests here have spoken about this. I think there's a place for fast recall, and because that reduces cognitive load. So it's not so much procedural. I wouldn't say it's procedural, but I would say in terms of recalling of facts and knowledge, that has a place in mastery.
Pete, do you want to add anything onto that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely in there. One of the 10 key principles that the NCTM have for their teaching for mastery sort of approaches is that the key facts, key relationships are known and can be recalled from memory. And the sort of the example I always use is if you don't look at the number 56 and immediately see that as 7 times 8, then there are a whole host of other mathematical ideas that you are going to struggle to grasp around, factorization and simplification and things of that nature, because you don't have that recall. Now, how we arrive at the how a pupil arrives at the ability to recall that. And how that is built on strong understanding of what multiplication is and why the numbers 7 and 8 combine in the way they do to produce that 56, I think is potentially the more interesting discussion. But in addition to to what Muhi was saying, around that 10 pages understood rather than memorized, I think this is a recurring theme among maths research, and the people I often quote around this are sort of John Mason and Anne Watson and people like that, Liz Bills, who will talk about educating awareness. Dave Hewitt as well talked about this, educating awareness and pupils becoming aware of mathematical relationship, mathematical structure. And that's not something that necessarily you can just teach in a way that if you say, remember this, do this, remember this, do this, that awareness is going to happen in pupils. That awareness is something that needs cultivating. It's something that needs working on. It's something that needs opportunities offered to look at ideas from different viewpoints and different start points. And that's what ideally for me, I think the goal of mathematics education should be about. And that, I think, has much more to offer in terms of pupils mastering mathematics, if you want to call it that, or use those words, because when that happens, and when pupils do sort of start to generate that awareness within themselves of mathematical ideas, and that doesn't necessarily mean they have to discover. There's not that doesn't necessarily mean discovery learning is the path to that. There are different paths to that, but when students have that awareness, that's when you start to see this, I can apply this now in different situations without recency, without cue, because there's that understanding of the key fundamental idea. And it's not just, I've memorized these steps to be able to solve this problem. There's this understanding of this key fundamental idea.
Yeah, exactly. And I agree with that last point. You have to understand the key idea and key concept behind it in order to really appreciate and understand the subject as well. In terms of your thoughts on the new research report from the DFE regarding the maths curriculum, what do you think of it? Let's start off with Lee, and then we'll come over to Pete.
I thought it was a good summary of some of the things we've been talking about, plus a few areas that we haven't. But it seems to bring together a lot of what is being talked about based on maybe the latest, not necessarily the latest research, but what's been actively talked about on places like Twitter. And I think we've got an increasing understanding of certain aspects of how we learn. So some of those aspects of cognitive science, things like working memory, and I know maths anxieties in there as well. It's good to see that in the report. It's a nice summary of sequencing of the strategies we should be using. Textbooks, it's nice to see in there as well, recognition of the value of a textbook. And again, a lot of the approaches taken into 5 big ideas, and a lot of what I've seen in the Singapore approach appear in that report as well. So it's a good summary, and there's a lot of references to look through at the end as well. So it's quite a nice, I think it's quite a nice vision of where we are at the moment. I mean, I don't think it doesn't have all the answers though, and I think that this is the problem that we've talked about, the implementation of all of this, the implementation of mastery, or the implementation of the recommendations of the report, I think is the bit we're missing.
Okay, so I'm just going to quickly, before I come to you, Pete, I'm just going to quickly outline what is actually said in the report for our listeners. In the maths report that was released by the DFE, it says that despite English pupils achieving, on average, higher attainment than pupils in many other countries, the attainment gap between low and high achievers in England is still wide. England performs well in mathematics compared with other countries, although it doesn't tell us in the report which countries that they've identified. And mathematics mathematics continues to be the most popular subject to study at A-level. And it talks about how they've made revisions to the A-level maths, redesigned the GCSE math specs so that there's more rigor and challenge. They've established the National Centre of Excellence for Maths, which I didn't know. They've set higher targets for teacher recruitment. So because there's a shortage of maths specialists, that was a focus, and making sure that there's correct professional development programs for teachers. And then it goes on to say that the average attainment gap between disadvantaged and advantaged pupils is also wide. And right now, disadvantaged pupils in England are much less likely than their advantaged peers to achieve the grade 4, which is pretty normal because that's what it's always been like. And also, they're not meeting the expected standards at Key Stage 1, 2, or even in EFES, which suggests that this is happening right from the beginning of a child's maths education, right from the beginning. Pete, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, what it suggests is that, and this is something that I think many teachers are aware of and many in education are aware of. What it suggests is that there is a disparity in very early opportunity to engage with mathematical ideas, and that those early opportunities are most likely to be predicated on socioeconomic background. So, if you're from a family where there is, a bit of sort of culture about, well, not necessarily culture is the wrong word, but where there are parents who, or loved ones, family members who will take the time and who have the time to sort of engage kids in mathematical ideas, very early mathematical ideas, but preschool and pre any formal learning, then these kids are going to start with an advantage over those whose parents, don't have either the time because they're working 50 hours a week or 60 hours a week just to put food on the table, or who don't have the inclination, don't have the background themselves in education to sort of value that and see why that's important. That these kids are going to start off school life with a disparity. And obviously what the report, highlights, one of the things the report highlights is the need to very early on try and close that gap, because all it does is widen as time goes on. And those early sort of experiences preschool being a very strong predictor of later success and also later difficulty.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Pete. Mohi, what are your thoughts?
I think overall, I do agree with quite a bulk of the report, but there are, I think, quite a few statements that are either problematic or are quite outdated. So, for example, the statement regarding primary school textbooks, that was from research done in 1998. Obviously, we're way past 1998 now. And so there's been a lot more new developments in primary education and primary textbooks. For example, the new curriculum in 2014, or the fact that the DFE approved at one stage, one of the only books was Maths No Problems textbooks, which is based on Singapore maths. And so there's been a lot of developments in primary maths since 1998. However, the report still mentions this report without really going into these new developments. So that was a bit strange for me. And there's a few other things, such as the use of concrete materials, which is obviously something I strongly agree with. But some of the reports, it kind of is quite suggestive that that's not a good approach. Well, that's what I got from the report. It's not a great approach to have too much concrete. But the thing that they kind of maybe didn't understand was that the concrete is linked to the abstract. So the only reason we're really using the concrete is for children to understand the maths, the foundations of the maths, so that when we get to the abstract, and that could happen in the same lesson or a few lessons down the line, that they can link what they've done using the concrete to the abstract to make more sense of it. And so I think it wasn't as detailed as I would have hoped. And some of the statements were suggestive in not a positive way. And some of the statements were just really, really outdated. However, majority of it, I totally agree with, but there was some problematic statements I feel could have been handled a bit better.
Okay,
yeah,
so
I agree, actually.
Okay, Pete, yeah,
Sorry.
go for it.
Sorry, Sobia, I was just going to say, yeah, I agree. I mean, I read that report, and I and looked at quite a few of the footnote things as well, and it seems like there are parts of it that are written by somebody that knows and has very strong ideas about what they think maths education should be about and the best way to do it, and there are parts that clearly they don't have the same experience and the same understanding and knowledge of, because they're very sort of potentially contradictory in nature, and they very much support a narrative. And it does seem to me that that report is, the research that they've looked at and the things that they've looked at least in places and in a number of places, they've looked for research that confirms their narrative. That's what it appears to me. And that they've not necessarily looked more widely, either because they don't want to or because they're not aware that those sort of things exist. So, like both have said, there are some good things in there, but there are a number of things in there that anybody who's read a bit more widely around this would be disagreeing with, in terms of, as Muhi's mentioned, some of the stuff around the use of the concrete pictorial abstract. I think anybody who, the person who wrote this doesn't have a strong background in that. This sort of sectioning of knowledge into declarative, procedural, and conditional, with this implication that is the order. And if you read this report, that I don't think it's necessarily stated within it, but there is a definite sense from the way it's written that the author of this report, who I don't know who it is, doesn't say, but seems to think that the first thing taught should be declarative knowledge, then procedural knowledge, then conditional knowledge.
Yeah,
and,
that's right.
In reality, it's a much more fluid mix than that. These things build off each other, and they reinforce each other. And again, we're coming back to what the NCTM says around this, around procedural knowledge and conceptual knowledge, and the fact that these should be developed in tandem and alongside each other. Yeah, there's a lot. There are some good things in that report. There's a lot to criticise, but we could be here a very long time if we wanted to go into.
And yeah, there's we've not got much time left, so I just want to finish off with a few bits and pieces now. It goes on to talk about East Asian classrooms, and it talks about how there's little differentiation in those classrooms and how pupils learn and do the same thing. It says that 51% of Singaporean pupils, compared to just 11% of English pupils, are described as having the ability to apply basic mathematical knowledge in a variety of situations. And the reason for this success is because there's a powerful curriculum and plenty of opportunities to engage in purposeful, intelligent practice, which lead to better outcomes for pupils. So my question to you, Lee, is that we're talking about Singapore maths. How do you use Singapore maths in your teaching? What's different? What's good and not so good about it?
Okay, well, if I can just pick up on what you've just said as well. I mean, in Singapore, my understanding from reading about the structure of the school system, I mean, there is a setting or a streaming system where less, if you like, or lower attaining mathematicians are identified and put onto a different stream in Singapore. So if it depends how PISA and TIMS actually select students to measure them, because if there's two major streams in Singapore. One is a more academic route, and the other one is less academic. So there's a little bit more to how Singapore select and maybe measure their mathematicians. But in terms of what they do, I mean, it's a very demanding secondary curriculum, because I think that their primary curriculum and their primary teaching and learning is very robust. There's no reference to bar modelling at Singapore, or almost no referencing to bar modelling. So I think the expectation is that students they've established the solving of problems, perhaps without bar modelling, or using a different approach when it gets to secondary. So that's one maybe slight disadvantage. It's very demanding. But to use it as it is, it's not necessarily accessible to every student who hasn't got that primary background.
So should we be teaching using this method then?
And well, there are aspects which are, which come across with the NCETM mastery curriculum, or the 5 big ideas. So the some of the aspects that are good are common manipulatives. So they use one common manipulative in secondary throughout the entire scheme of work. So they don't use more than one manipulative in general. They use one, which is algebra discs, and they use a sequence of worked examples and practice questions leading up to independent practice. So that structure, identifying the correct worked examples, is really well done. Although I continue to try and criticise it and add to it and change it, but there's some of the aspects that are good and challenging.
What about you, Mohi? What do you think about Singapore maths?
Well, as the founder of Singapore Maths Academy, it's probably going to be something positive. However, I've got something that that might be a bit controversial, in the sense that I'm sure the audience will agree as well as the guests in the show. But there is no such thing as Singapore Maths. When children get their timetables in Singapore, it doesn't say Singapore Maths on it; it just says Maths. It's something that we've kind of created outside of Singapore. And really, Singapore Maths, what we call Singapore Maths, is just good practice based on excellent research. And that research doesn't necessarily have to be from Singapore themselves, but that research is from all around the world. So Singapore, as I think Pete mentioned, started their journey to what's now known as Singapore Maths in the early 80s. And at the same time, in the early 80s, we in the UK created this report called the Cockcroft Report in, I think it was 82. And Singapore used the Cockcroft Report better than we did and implemented some of the suggestions, which was one of the key suggestions was that using problem solving as a core foundation for maths education. And that's exactly what they did, along with other research such as Jerome Bruner's CPA approach. So what we call the CPA approach now is a concrete pictorial abstract approach, which just generally means that when we start new ideas, it would be a great way to introduce concrete manipulatives to understand the idea before going on to pictorial representation and abstract, and linking them together so that the abstract doesn't seem so abstract, and we can make sense of it a lot more. And kind of example I give in my training sessions to schools is when we kind of think about our children. Let's say we have a small baby, and as they're growing, we give them toys and we say, hey, here's your red car, here's your house. So whatever you give them, let's say a car, you keep giving them a car until one day they say car and they point at it, right? And we kind of get happy over that because we've said car so many times and have shown them what a car is using concrete materials. Then the next step would be for us to kind of read a lot more to our children, right? And so when they see a picture of a car in a book, they point at it and say car. So they've transferred that knowledge from concrete to pictorial to see that there's the same thing there. And then finally, abstract in this example would be when children start reading and can actually read CAR is spelled, it's car. And so that's the abstract, the final stage of the CPA approach. And that theory from Jerome Bruner, from his research, is not just for maths, it's for many walks of life. And so using that approach in primary specifically to begin with has helped a lot of schools and a lot of teachers understand maths themselves, but also become much better teachers. And so Singapore Maths, though the CPA approach is not from Singapore, it's from Jerome Bruner in the 60s, an American psychologist. What Singapore Maths has done is try to get us to think more about research before making any decisions, so having a more informed decisions from research. And along with many other researchers like Zoltan Dean and so forth, Singapore Maths has really helped, I suppose, many countries evolve their ideas of maths education. I'm not saying Singapore is the first and foremost country in the world to kind of do this. There have been many others, as we mentioned 100 years ago, people have talked about maths mastery. And so what initially started off as Singapore Maths around about 10 years ago, when I first got into Singapore Maths and became one of the trainers for Maths No Problem, what happened then was that there was a kind of a movement which focused heavily on Singapore Maths. Then that changed to the NCTM's take on Singapore maths and Shanghai maths, and the research and their travels to Shanghai as well led them to think about maths mastery. And so what Singapore maths now is really maths mastery. That's what we're aiming for. So at the heart of Singapore maths is something that's I think all maths teachers agree on, is problem solving. So if you type in Google search Singapore maths syllabus, for example, then you'll find a document there that goes through the Singapore maths syllabus. And one of the first pages is a diagram that has the heart of the diagram is maths problem solving. And around problem solving are things like attitudes, skills, concepts, processes, and metacognition. And amongst concepts is something that amongst processes, we've talked about many different things like reasoning, communication, connections, thinking skills, heuristics, application and modeling. And so bar modeling is something that we talk about quite often when it comes to Singapore maths. But it's one of the things that they've done really well on, but it's not the only heuristic that they use. They still have things like, trial and improvement, draw a table out. So all of the things that I would say and argue, and every maths teacher would argue, these are really good ways of solving problems as well as bar modeling, because bar modeling cannot be used in every single problem. That's something that they do really well on, but we do heavily focus on bar modeling. And actually one of my training companies is called Bar Model Company, because I know that, it's something that at that time when I created the company, I knew it was something that is going to explode anytime soon in England. And it has done so with various different companies, including White Rose as well. We have their bar Bemba concept.
Right, Mohi, I'm going to stop you there because we're running out of time. Any final thoughts about Singapore maths and what we're talking about, Pete?
Yeah, I mean, just most of it's been said. Lee rightly points out that, in terms of by the time Singapore pupils get to secondary age, those foundations are so well understood for those that are on that academic pathway that it's rarely do they actually need the sort of concrete and pictorial, because they have that understanding of structure, and that's what that's about. It's about making sure kids have that understanding of structure that they can now visualize and that they can now think about and work with in a way that means they no longer need it. I think the other thing that we should be aware of is obviously the cultural impacts of all of these things, and of the culture surrounding these things. The culture towards maths education and education in general is very different in some of these places than it is in England, which means any attempt to transplant wholesale is very, very unlikely to be successful. And what we're looking at here is taking the best of those ideas and interpreting them in a way that is going to sort of fit and work with what we're working with in this country.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you all so much for coming on. There's so much more we can discuss, but I've run out of time, I'm afraid. It's been a pleasure to host you all today. It's been a fantastic discussion, and thank you so much for bringing your expertise and experience with you. I hope you all have a great week during Maths Week.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Right, next up we have... Bye, thank you. Next up we have Martin Bloomfield. We're going to come back to him after the news.
Introducing Amanda Davey. Amanda is one of the first specialist teacher assessors for dyscalculia in the UK and offers dyscalculia tutoring and bespoke training for schools. With 26 years of teaching and tutoring experience in the UK, Amanda offers specialist online tuition focused on building confidence and developing skills. Amanda also offers online and face-to-face training on dyscalculia for educators, informing practitioners as to how to identify children that may have dyscalculia and how to support them in class. Find out more about Amanda and what she can offer you at www.amanda-davey-dyscalculia.co.uk. This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News with Tom Hopkins-Burke.
This is Tom Hopkins-Burke with your weekend Teachers Talk Radio news. The Institute of Fiscal Studies has warned that measures to help children catch up on lost learning could arrive too late. IFS researchers stated that if new spending is only announced in the autumn, the actual measures could be delayed well into 2022, potentially too late to effectively make up for lost learning. The IFS has also warned that the government's catch-up fund equates to £100 per pupil per year, well below the £1,600 per pupil being spent in the United States. The warning follows the resignation of Education Recovery Commissioner Sir Kevin Collins, who condemned the £1.4 billion recovery fund for children as far short of what is needed. Public Health England data shows that the Delta COVID-19 variant has affected around 1 in 250 schools. Also known as the Indian variant, the Delta variant has been linked to 97 confirmed COVID-19 outbreaks in primary and secondary schools in the last 4 weeks. Professor Christina Pargle from University College London said that the rise of the Delta variant meant that the government needs to get serious about reducing cases in schools. The Delta variant is more likely to lead to hospitalisations than the Alpha variant first detected in Kent, although the second vaccine dose is likely to help protect against Delta. A pioneering business in Hartlepool has been set up to help prevent gaming addiction in children. Jack Story aims to raise awareness about the dangers of gaming and provide help to youngsters suffering from gaming addiction. Funded by the National Lottery, the business is run by former Hartlepool teacher David Bradley and occupational therapist Charlotte Bell. Mr. Bradley told the Hartlepool Mail that, "We are quite pro-gaming because it's amazing. It's all about the dangers of the unsafe side of it." Teachers Talk Radio is looking for a new weekend newsreader. Email teacherstalkradio@gmail.com for more information. That was your weekend education news with Tom Hopkins-Burke.
Thanks for that, Tom. That was a fantastic discussion with Peter Lee and Mohi, and I could have gone on for a lot longer, but unfortunately we ran out of time. We'll try and get them on again another time. Okay, we've got Martin Bloomfield coming up now. He's from Dyslexia Bites. He specialises in dyslexia awareness, SEN ethics, and works globally and throughout the EU. We're going to listen to Martin and his experience of dyslexia and working with students in the classroom. Martin, how are you?
Very well indeed, thank you. The sun's out and everyone's going to be a bit happier now. So,
Brilliant. Thank you for coming on today. Can you just tell our listeners, what is your role and what do you do?
Okay, I've got a couple of roles. I run the Dyslexia Bites project, and that developed out of doing a lot of intercultural work on dyslexia awareness. So one of the interesting things about dyslexia awareness is people usually think about it in what you might call reductivist terms. They'll give a definition and they won't take into account how that definition impacts onto a culture or the kind of social context that you come from. So Dyslexia Bites looks at the cultural and social contexts of dyslexia and how dyslexia appears different to different types of people. I also work in various universities training organizations in dyslexia awareness and doing work on ethics. And I work for a company called York Associates, and York Associates is a communications training organization. I run neurodiversity courses there and some intercultural courses. And I'm working on some EU Erasmus Plus projects as well, which is really good fun. One on the integration of refugees and immigrants, one on free training for teachers anywhere in the world, digital training in neurodiversity awareness. And one, which is really interesting, on trying to find a way of, as it were, aligning every different country's or European country's views of dyslexia, because they all have different views of what dyslexia is.
Wow, that's really interesting. And I really love the fact that you're doing this on an international scale. Can you just explain to our listeners who don't know anything about dyslexia, what is dyslexia?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And it honestly depends on who you ask and where you ask. So for instance, one of the fascinating things is if you go to the British Dyslexia Association, they'll talk about it as a neurological difference. If you go to the International Dyslexia Association, the International Dyslexia Association calls it a literary acquisitional difference. So it's about literary acquisition. If you go to the European Dyslexia Association, they call it a literacy deficit. If you listen to the Rose Report, they'll call it a deficit as well. If you go to the British Psychological Society, they'll talk about it as it were, a developmental neurological condition. And so different people talk about it in different ways. Essentially, dyslexia is well known as people seeing words moving around on a page, and that's not dyslexia. That's something completely different. It's called Irlen syndrome, which is a visual processing syndrome. Dyslexia tends to come about in, as it were, it's a developmental neurological condition, or difference rather, and people with dyslexia tend to have difficulty with phonological processing speed. That is, when you read a word, translating that into sounds in your head. This leads to difficulty in reading comprehension. And at the same time, there are certain cognitive processing differences. So some things that people with dyslexia do, we're really good at processing, and other things we have difficulty. One of the things we have difficulty with is what they call rapid naming. That is, trying to recall what a word means, or trying to recall what a word is. And this is rapid naming, so we're slightly slower at that. So there's a slightly slower processing speed there. But there have been numerous studies. I mean, on my website, Dyslexia Bites, I cite at least 20 independent academic studies showing that dyslexic people always, or almost always, come out in, as it were, standardized and objective tests as highly creative. This isn't just trying to be nice to dyslexic people. This is study and research based.
That's a lot of information, and I can see how people would get confused with that. With the term neurodiversity, can you just explain what neurodiversity is for people as well?
Okay, yeah, it's a term that's bandied around quite a lot. So first of all, what it means is it takes the basis that we are all diverse neurologically. Our brains effectively are all built slightly differently. So it begins from the idea that we're all diverse, but neurodiversity specifically talks about categories of diversity, neurological categories. So my brain fits into the neurological category of dyslexia. Somebody else's brain will fit into the neurological category of autism. Somebody else's brain will fit into the neurological category of ADHD. And by the way, there's a lot of crossover between these categories as well. So I'm almost certainly ADHD, very, very strongly. I've never been tested, but everybody who knows me. And if you don't fit into these categories, you're not dyslexic. It's not like everyone's a bit dyslexic or everyone's a little bit autistic. That's not how it works. But the other side of that is that because everybody's diverse, this idea of neurotypical, that there's one normative standard of what the brain is kind of outdated, because that's not how evolution works. Evolution brings us diversity. And so neurodiversity is effectively categorizing different neurological types, and that some of us fit into some types and others don't. That's all that means.
So how common is dyslexia then?
Good question. In the Dyslexia Compass project I'm working on, which is the project to try to align different views of dyslexia, it came about because I was talking to a colleague and we kind of juggled this idea together. If you go to Germany, let's put it like this. In the European Union has two different organizations that have given the number of dyslexics in the European Union, and they give different numbers. Within the European Union, you've got all these different countries, and different countries give different numbers. So Germany, for instance, gives a different number. Within Germany, different states give a different number. You go to one state in Germany, and they'll claim that it's 17.5%, sorry, 15.7%. I get my numbers mixed up. They claim it's 15.7% of the population of that state with dyslexia. Go to a different state and it's 1.3% of the population. Most people say it's about 10 to 15% of the population. But in trying to decide how we can align these measurements, it turns out that no one knows where these figures come from. So, for instance, if you get yourself a diagnostic assessment for dyslexia in London, where there isn't a central database of how many people are dyslexic, they don't give that result to a central database. And so, when we say how many people are dyslexic, we'll say, well, in England and Wales, only those people with a diagnostic assessment, but there's no central database for it, so we don't know. In Scotland, which is fascinating, teachers generally are responsible for identifying people with dyslexia. Now that has its positives and its negatives. One of the negatives, of course, is that very few teachers have been given specialist dyslexia training.
Yes.
And so we don't know is the only answer I can give. Most people say about 10 to 15%. I'll go along with that experientially and anecdotally, but no one can tell you.
So in terms of being in the classroom, and how do we spot the signs for dyslexia? How can we support dyslexics in the classroom? And also, you talked about an assessment. How, you know, what is the typical cost for an assessment?
So the first thing, if you want to spot dyslexia in the classroom or indeed anywhere, this is what I say to everybody. What you're looking for is somebody who is pretty intelligent, who can't seem to get the words down on page, or who can't seem to answer the questions you want them to answer, or who can't seem to turn up on time, or who gets her dates wrong. So what you're looking for effectively is strange discrepancies between somebody's general intelligence and specific things that they struggle with. And these things that they struggle with tend to be those standardizations that we fill our schools with. The day starts here, the lesson lasts this long, you've got to do your homework, and this counts as success and this doesn't count as success. Most of the time, dyslexic people struggle with that. I struggled terribly with it. I mean, really badly. I was the bottom of the class my entire school life. It was humiliating, and it was demeaning, and it was soul destroying, quite frankly. I'm about to finish my doctorate.
Yeah,
so
but presumably at that time, sorry to interrupt, Martin,
please.
presumably at that time, there wasn't much awareness, right?
No,
was there?
Yeah. People knew that there was such a thing called dyslexia, but they didn't know much more than that. And this spread to the other children. This is really key to what you're talking about. There was something called the remedial class in my primary school. And the remedial class is where all the dyslexic and autistic and Down's kids went, and all the other children avoided them like the plague, because it might have been contagious and they were different, and so there was this disjunct between the children in the remedial class and everybody else. And I swear, until I was about 16, I thought remedial was a term of abuse. That's what it was used as. Now, this is really key, because he said, how can we support dyslexic students? There have been some really interesting studies on this. The first thing is early diagnosis or early recognition, as early as possible. So we're starting to look for that discrepancy in how intelligent they are, but their schoolwork, that kind of thing. Once we've started to think about dyslexia, there was a study at the University of Birmingham about 2 years ago that showed that there are effectively 4 ways that students look at themselves, and that teachers look at students, or lecturers look at students, or fellow pupils or fellow students look at students. And these 4 ways have an actual impact on the learning of the person with dyslexia. So these 4 ways are as follows. Number 1, the patient. The patient looks upon dyslexia as a medical or a neurological condition, or a deficit of some description. And if I look at myself as having a medical condition, the chances are it will create something called sort of learned helplessness, or something that I find success difficult, because I see myself almost as a victim of circumstance, of neurological circumstance. The second way of looking at dyslexia is as the student. The student was named as a type of viewer of dyslexia, and the student looks at dyslexia as somebody who has difficulty with writing, somebody who has difficulty with reading. So somebody, as the EDA, the International Dyslexia Association, have literacy acquisition difficulties. And so you get these great big umbrella organizations labeling people in ways which actually retard their learning, which is terrible. The other 2 ways of dyslexia were the positive way, and these actually help people learn. One of them was called what you would call the hemispherist. The hemispherist looks at dyslexia as having a different brain, and that this different brain has some good things and some bad things, and that's the way that brains are built. And the final category of people who look at dyslexia is the campaigner. And that's the person who says, I've got dyslexia, you're doing this wrong. You need to change your practices. And so you've got these 4 categories of how we look at dyslexia. The first 2 impact negatively on learning. The second 2 impact positively on learning. And that's really interesting, that we have to look at the psychology of what dyslexia is and how it appears to us.
Yeah, I mean, I know that when I'm in the classroom, sometimes I'm not sure if a student is dyslexic or not, unless we've been told that they've had an assessment and we've got that information in front of us. So for teachers out there, it is really useful to find out what are the typical signs and then put them forward to the SENCO and say to them that we think that you need to investigate this further. And if it's common across other subjects as well, so not just your subject, but if this is happening across whole school.
And this isn't a problem with your school, it's a systemic problem within the education system. But when you spot the signs of dyslexia and report this to a SENCO, what you are necessarily doing is you're being the student. You're looking at dyslexia as the student, as the person who has difficulties with reading, writing, producing work, remembering, that kind of thing. So you can only spot dyslexia as deficit. And then you report it to the SENCO, who deals with it in a deficit remedial sense. And this in itself starts to make the person with dyslexia look at herself or look at himself as the student, as somebody with reading and writing difficulties. And by the way, this is hardly surprising. I've been trying to work out a different kind of vocabulary we can use about dyslexia, because dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, dysphasia, dysnomia, they all begin with dys. Every single one of these, which comes from the Greek meaning can't or something. And so what we're doing from a very early age, we're labeling children by what they can't do. This is really damaging. If we label children by what they can't do, and we ask them to label themselves by what they can't do, because as they grow up, they're not stupid. They know what dys means. You know, dysfunctional. You know, they know these words. If we're labeling kids by what they can't do, then we are disabling. And this is a really difficult thing for us to navigate. What we need to start doing instead, reducing the literacy input in our lessons, thinking about how to present words. One of the interesting pieces of research over the past few years is eye tracking, where dyslexic people look when they're reading. And I'd tried to explain this to people before I'd seen the research. And now, once I've got the research, it's a lot easier. Most people, when they read, zigzag in very straight lines across the page. And while they zigzag, their eyes focus 3 to 4 times a second as they're zigzagging. And these focus points tend to be fairly standard. People with dyslexia, they go up and down and they're backwards and forwards, and the focus points can be really big or really small. One of the ways of reducing the stresses and the traumas that this brings is reduce the line length, slightly increase the distance between the lines, increase the space between the letters. So you're actually, you end up being forced to use less writing in the same amount of space. But what you're doing is you're making the trial of reading a lot easier, because I find that if I have to read a lot, I can't. And my eyes are all over the place and it gets exhausting and I lose my place in what I'm writing. And so shorten the line length, increase the space between the lines, increase the space between the letters. Really easy to do on Microsoft Word or PowerPoint or something like that. And try to use, there's a lot of research gone into fonts. Don't be fooled by the specialist dyslexic fonts. Do not be fooled by them. There's very little research to show that they work. But something that we find tends to work are humanist type fonts. And humanist fonts are sans serif fonts, but they're kind of soft. So fonts like, my favorite is called Leela Wadi, L-E-E-L-A-W-A, no, hang on, L-E-E, L-A, La, W-A-Y-D-E-E, D, Leela Wadi.
Okay. I'll have to have a look at that. Those are some really, really good tips there, because obviously we, you know, as classroom teachers, sometimes we don't get specialist training in school because there's so much going on in school sometimes, and that does get missed. So really, really good ideas there. In terms of the costs for a typical assessment that we were talking about before, how much does it normally cost? And does that come from schools, or does that come from parents? Who puts towards those costs? What normally happens?
Okay, so you will be extraordinarily lucky. In fact, I would be surprised if anybody in Britain could find a diagnostic assessment for less than £100. Now, this is really, really shocking, because you'll find not only the people at the lower end of the economic scale, but actually the people in the middle of the economic scale find this really, really difficult. People who have got disposable wealth may be able to afford this, but actually we often hear £400, and it can go up to £750, £850 for a diagnostic assessment. And we go, oh my goodness, people at the bottom end of the economic spectrum can't afford this. Actually, it goes deeper than that. People in the middle of the economic spectrum can't afford this. These are the squeezed middle, or the jams, whoever, whichever politician is describing it differently. They're all talking about the same type of people, hardworking people who've got what you might call almost sort of kind of middle class jobs, but these jobs don't leave them with any disposable income. Now, for me, something like, I mean, I'm not going to tell you exactly how much I pay for my flat, but this range of 400 to 750, somewhere within that range, that's a month's rent. Now, how can I afford a month's rent to find out whether I am dyslexic or not? Especially if once you've found out, then you have to have the resources and the time to argue with the schools to get some kind of accommodations put in place. Sometimes schools have the budget for dyslexia assessments, much of the time they don't. So most of the time, it will come out of the parents' pockets. And if the parents don't have the time, the resources, or the disposable income to be able to afford that, then you'll get kids who are just left behind.
That's quite sad, really, because part of our roles as educators is to make sure that we're supporting all of our students, regardless of the circumstances that they're in. What would you say to people who think that there's no such thing as dyslexia, that it doesn't exist?
A couple of things. I mean, on the one hand, I'd say they're probably approaching it from the wrong angle. So there's a philosophical position called essentialism. And essentialism is this view that you can boil something down to its constituent core and identify that as being dyslexic. If you're not an essentialist, then you don't have to go, there's no such thing as dyslexia. There's a guy called Professor Elliott a couple of years ago who wrote an article, and he's written articles along these lines for quite a few years, saying there's no such thing as dyslexia. And the reason he comes to this conclusion is that effectively lots of different people with dyslexia show different manifestations of dyslexia, and there are different, it does different things to them. And because you can't identify the one thing that it does, then you shouldn't identify these things as dyslexia. But as I say, to take that view, you have to be an essentialist. And I'm not an essentialist about the world. So, you know, try to sort of imagine the horror that we're in a relationship. And I say to you, I love you. And you say, well, what's love? And the answer I give isn't the same as the answer your previous partner gave. And you go, well, there's no such thing as love. No one would say that. No one would say that. Or you know, I'm a human. Well, you tell me exactly what it is to be a human. I wouldn't even know where to start. And so this view that if you can't identify the one thing that keeps it together, then there's no such thing, is a mistaken view, a genuinely mistaken view. However, he has got a point. If we turn to Scotland, and I'm not criticizing the Scottish system, it's got some really positive things about it. But if we turn to Scotland, where teachers are identifying dyslexia, as you say, by as the student view of dyslexia, a deficit in reading or a slow reading speed, slow writing, bad handwriting, then effectively what they're doing is they're identifying literacy problems. And if you want to address that, then you address the literacy problems. And so depending on what people are identifying as dyslexia, different people identify dyslexia as different things. So we need to start coalescing around neurological definitions, I believe, because there is very strong evidence to say that the dyslexic brain is neurologically different from the non-dyslexic brain. And then we can then see clear families of manifestations, as it were. So categories of manifestations that cling to these neurological differences. And some of them are positive, as I say, and some of them are negative.
Is there any work being done towards that to make sure that everybody's consistently using the same definitions or languages? Is there any work being done within the sector you're in and across the profession, so to speak?
My project, the Dyslexia Compass, is trying to do that. But what we're trying to do it by looking at different ways that different assessors around Europe assess dyslexia and try to find out what they all agree on and where the disagreements lie. And so we're trying to identify the areas of agreement between different assessors. This isn't, as it were, a neurological approach. This is an empirical approach. It's the best we've got at the moment, because the reason that there is no work going into finding the one definition is that, and this is what helps Professor Elliott's case, different people define it differently. It's not that we don't think it's the same thing. So when the European Dyslexia Association and the British Dyslexia Association define dyslexia differently, they're not saying we're talking about different things. They're, if you like, they are the blind people feeling the elephant. And if you know the story about the 5 blind people feeding the elephant, and one blind person feels an elephant's leg and thinks, ah, there's a tree. And another blind person feels the trunk and goes, it's a snake.
Yeah.
And they're all describing the same thing, but they have to coalesce somehow. And one of the great methods there is of coalescing these descriptions is for people to have an open and honest and self-critical dialogue with themselves and with each other.
And so only after that, I feel that educators can actually understand fully and start using practical techniques that can help engage our students who do have dyslexia within the classroom. Can you just explain a bit more about Dyslexia Bites and your work and some of the projects that you've done? Because I think our listeners would be really interested in the work that you are carrying out right now.
I can, and I'd love to, but before I do, I'd like to just step back for a second and say 2 other things about how we deal with people with dyslexia, how we teach people with dyslexia.
That's absolutely fine.
The first thing is through visuals, that is infographics. Now, I'm not an adherent of the way that there are visual learners, there are kinesthetic learners. I think that's based on flawed understanding of some research.
Yes.
But people who are dyslexic tend to have a very visual memory, an eidetic memory. We also tend to understand infographics far easier than lots and lots of work, lots and lots of words. And you can see the connections within infographics. And this is how dyslexic people think. We see connections for very good neurological reasons, which I won't go into right now. If you're using infographics, try to make sure that the infographics and the message you're giving are closely aligned. So it's not just like you've got a spider diagram with lots of information, because the information and the shape of the spider diagram have nothing to do with each other. So what you need to do is, for instance, if you're teaching the phoneme D and the grapheme D for the phoneme D, you want to maybe have a picture of a dog's face with the dog's tail up in the air, showing the letter D, because D, dog, D, and you've got this connection. This accesses something called the ventral pathways in the brain. The ventral pathways in the brain are what gives us comprehension and understanding. And so if we embed the message in the image and embed the image in the message, then we can create greater understanding and comprehension. The other thing to say is there's been some really interesting research. I couldn't spell until I was about 16. I couldn't.
Okay.
And in fact, I was thinking about it yesterday. I remember often spelling the same word on a page 3 times, thinking, well, one of them is going to be right. And I had no idea why any of them was going to be right. When I was about 16, 17, I don't know why, I decided to teach myself etymology and morphology.
Yes.
Simple etymology and simple morphology. So I can kind of understand by the sound of a word that it's going to be Greek, or that it's going to be Latin in origin, or Germanic in origin. And then I started to look at the morphemes, the prefixes, the suffixes, and the root words in between.
Yeah,
There's
Alex
really...
Quigley. Sorry, Alex Quigley has done a lot of work on this in his book, The Vocabulary Gap, and we've had him on the show. And
Right.
yeah, he talks about exactly the same thing. So I'm really fascinated by this. Carry on here.
That he may have been involved in this research. I'm not 100% sure, but there's been some research to show that dyslexics understand meanings carried through morphemes faster than non-dyslexics. And so if we want to teach people with dyslexia, go for the morphemes, because what you're doing is you're showing the structure of a word rather than having to decode every single grapheme and phoneme. You're just showing the structure of a word. I understand structures. So I understand the graphemes, I understand prefixes and suffixes and root words quite easily. I still can't spell names, and I can't spell words from non-Indo-European backgrounds. So I do a lot of work with Dyslexia Bites and come across a lot of African names. African names are really interesting because they use the same letters that we use, and they tend to use similar styles of groups of groups of vowels and consonants, but they're different from what we use. And when I read a name, I was reading one recently, I have to add de love, and it's that when my phonological decoding starts to collapse. And so we want to get past phonological decoding, go towards morphological decoding, morphological understanding. We're bringing comprehension of words and learning of words and learning to spell far closer. And this is where, as I said, Dyslexia Bites focuses. If you are dyslexic, one of the things that you will be labeled as is somebody with poor timekeeping. Well, timekeeping is a culturally relative thing. Different cultures have different views on timekeeping. So you wouldn't be labeled as poor timekeeping if you lived perhaps in India or South America. This shows very clearly that our understanding and our descriptions and definitions of dyslexia are culturally laden. People with autism, for instance, they find social cues difficult to decode. Autistic people are not as they don't come across as communal as other people. Well, in some cultures that's true, and in other cultures it's not. And we have to start looking at the descriptions we give as culturally defined, culturally couched, because until we do that, every time then that the British Dyslexia Association or the European Dyslexia Association or the International Dyslexia Association based in America starts helping an African country understand dyslexia, they're importing this white Eurocentric view of dyslexia into a context that perhaps isn't appropriate.
Yeah.
And that's really, really dangerous. When we then get, for instance, the European Dyslexia Association, the International Dyslexia Association, who talk about it as a deficit in phonological processing, then you go over to China or Japan, their brains, in China and Japan, your brain, when you're reading logosyllabic script, for instance, doesn't do phonological decoding. Something else is happening in your brain when you're reading logosyllabic script. So there isn't a phonological coding problem. And so if we describe it as phonological coding or a phonological decoding problem, and people aren't having problems phonologically decoding, then they'll go, there's no such thing as dyslexia in China and Japan. And many people do say this. And yet, on the other hand, this has terrible consequences. I was talking to a lady recently who has Korean background and lives in Germany, and she was describing a bridge in Korea. I think it was probably in Seoul. And this bridge has got pictures of teddy bears on it now because the authorities are trying to stop children throwing themselves off to their deaths because they can't cope with the education system. Now, if that's not impactful enough to make us realize that dyslexia is not just about phonological decoding, that we have to look at it from a deeper sense, and we have to place it within the cultural context in which dyslexic people live. I don't know what is, because we need to save these kids' lives. We just do.
And is that what you mean by intercultural perspectives?
Yeah. So there's a number of things. So first of all, I sometimes take culture to be a very blunt sledgehammer, if I can use that analogy, and say, okay, so we talk about culture. Here's Japan, here's Nigeria, here's Kenya. I don't like using culture and country as synonyms because clearly they're not. But they're useful sort of hooks to understand culture by. There are all sorts of ways we look at culture. There are cultural theorists, people like Trompenas, people like Hofstede, people like Pauls, people like Lewis, and they use dimensions of culture. So, for instance, how you look at time, how you look at proximity, how you look at uncertainty, these kinds of things. And this is another way of looking at culture. And then, of course, there are subcultures within a society. So, for instance, there are subcultures within Britain who are less likely to say, I have cancer, I have COVID, I have dyslexia, because they're seen as somehow negative. And one of the things is we've now got to understand that there's a cultural aspect and try to reach across to these subcultures and say, it's okay, don't worry about it. You know, it's not a problem. And you know, open our arms, as it were. And if we don't do this, then when we say how many kids are dyslexic, we're actually leaving out an entire demographic of people. One of the most striking examples of this is the Netherlands. If you go to the Netherlands, their official statistics for how many people have got dyslexia, round about 20%. Unless you're from an ethnic minority, in which case it's about 5%. Now, this is more than likely culturally based. This difference is based in poverty, it's based in cultural background, it's based in whether that culture expects to succeed in the education system, it's based in all of these different things. And we need to start addressing it from this kind of perspective.
Right, I'm going to stop there because we've run out of time. It's been a fantastic show today, made more fantastic by my guests. There's been some really interesting shows this week. Do tune into Mal talking about an ex-pupil who died, which was quite a sad show. New hosts Scott, Femi, Amanda and Tabitha were awesome. Tom was in Scotland and Kate had a Global Teacher Prize winner for her show. Yesterday, Tom and Samuel's shows were fantastic. I'm not just hosting, I'm also hooked on the amount of talent and experience we have on at Teachers Talk Radio. And I can listen when I can to everyone because the CPD is amazing. There's lots of interesting information there. If you would like to know more from Martin, you can find out from @Bites Dyslexia. And I just wanted to make sure that the reference that I made to Alex Quigley, it was actually closing the vocabulary gap. Sometimes I talk too fast and I didn't make that reference properly. That's it for today. Have a great first week back. Graham and Khalil and Tony are going to be on their usual slots, and also Fiona is going to be a new host. We've only got 7 weeks to go until the summer. Take care.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.